When modern metallurgists first analyzed a specific group of swords recovered from Viking graves, the chemical readings were so wildly out of place that researchers assumed their laboratory equipment was broken. The researchers were looking at a collection of about 170 ancient weapons, mostly pulled from Scandinavian riverbeds and pagan burials. Forged directly into the metal of each blade was a very specific Frankish name, flanked by crosses, Ulfberht. This diagram shows exactly why these blades baffled scientists. The standard European forging method of the 9th century produced something called bloomery iron, a spongy, inconsistent metal filled with weak structural impurities known as slag. But the authentic Ulfberht blades are forged from crucible steel. They contain almost zero slag and boast a carbon content of up to 1.2%, perfectly distributed throughout the metal. Finding steel of this microscopic purity dating back to the year 850 is roughly the archaeological equivalent of unearthing a functioning lithium-ion battery in the ruins of ancient Roman Empire. It defies the accepted timeline of human engineering. The physical barrier here is temperature. To create crucible steel, a blacksmith has to place iron and carbon inside a sealed clay container and completely melt them together. That chemical bond requires a furnace temperature of approximately 1600 degrees Celsius. This timeline charts European metallurgical capacity. In the 9th century, the absolute maximum heat a European bloomery forge could achieve was about 800 degrees. They would not invent the blast furnaces capable of reaching a 1600-degree melting point for another 8 centuries during the Industrial Revolution. Modern blacksmiths have attempted to recreate an Ulfberht using strictly 9th-century tools. The process requires 11 consecutive hours of grueling high-temperature hammering and an incredibly rare level of artisan expertise to produce a single blade. European smiths physically lacked the thermal technology to melt iron and carbon together. Therefore, the raw material for these swords had to come from somewhere else, specifically an advanced civilization thousands of miles away. A major faction of Norsemen rarely sailed west toward England. Known as the Volga Vikings, these merchants navigated deep into the winding river networks of modern-day Russia, pushing south to reach the Caspian Sea. They were traveling to the metallurgical heartlands of Central Asia and the Middle East. Cities like Merv and Herat were already operating high-temperature crucible furnaces, producing enormous quantities of a legendary high-carbon material known as wood steel. The Norsemen arrived with cargo holds full of amber, furs, and enslaved people. They traded those goods to Islamic merchants in exchange for pure wood steel ingots and dirhams, silver coins minted by the Islamic caliphates, thousands of which have been found buried in Scandinavian soil. This map traces that exact supply chain. The high-carbon ingots originated in Central Asian foundries, crossed the Caspian Sea, and moved thousands of miles up the Volga River into the trading hubs of Scandinavia and the Baltic coast. This continent-spanning corridor reveals a highly integrated global economy, operating hundreds of years before the Renaissance. But the name Ulfberht is not Norse or Arabic. It is a Frankish personal name, spelled out in Latin script and flanked by Christian crosses. The raw steel came from the east, but the finished brand belonged to Western Europe. Chemical analyses of the lead used in some of these sword handles point directly to the mining regions surrounding the Carolingian church monasteries. Abbeys like Fulda Abbey operated massive industrial-scale smithies, utilizing thousands of laborers to manufacture weapons to fulfill strict military quotas. The highest quality, most lethal weapons carried by pagan Viking raiders were likely mass-produced, branded, and sold by Christian monks, the very institutions those Vikings were actively raiding. Around the year 965, the Khazar Khaganate collapsed. This geopolitical fracture abruptly severed the Volga River trade route, shutting down the European pipeline of Eastern crucible steel overnight. The raw material vanished, but the immense prestige of the Ulfberht brand remained. Opportunistic blacksmiths immediately stepped in to fill the demand, sparking history's first major counterfeit market. They forged visually identical swords using weak, locally sourced bloomery iron and stamped the famous name on the side. This comparison highlights exactly how researchers spot the fakes. The authentic crucible steel blades spell the name with the final cross located before the T, but illiterate medieval forgers, copying the logo strictly from visual memory, routinely shift the final letter inside the crosses. Roughly 75% of all recovered Ulfberhts carry this typographical error. The stakes of this ancient branding fraud were lethal. Elite warriors traded massive fortunes for what they believed was indestructible steel, only to carry structurally compromised iron into combat. An authentic high-carbon Ulfberht offered mechanical advantages that ordinary iron could not match. The blade could absorb the lateral force of a heavy strike and spring perfectly back to true without bending. It retained a razor-sharp edge far longer, and it carried enough density to reliably pierce standard chainmail. When an ordinary slag-filled iron sword collided directly with an authentic Ulfberht in a parry, the inferior weapon was liable to notch deeply, bend out of shape, or shatter entirely on impact. For the wealthy Norse chieftains who could afford the staggering price tag, this was a definitive technological multiplier. It allowed a small number of elite fighters to systematically destroy their opponent's weapons and physically dominate the shield wall. By the year 1100, authentic crucible steel Ulfberts disappear from the archaeological record completely. With the eastern trade routes closed, the ability to put these weapons into the hands of European warriors vanished. The Ulfberht was a temporary anomaly. It was born from a cross-cultural technology transfer, a brief window where European craftsmen gained access to advanced materials from the Islamic world. Because they never figured out how to build the furnaces to melt the steel themselves, they could not sustain the technology once the supply chain broke. The rusted blades pulled from the mud of Scandinavia's rivers serve as a quiet historical warning. An entire civilization can hold advanced technology in its hands, use it to conquer their neighbors, and still lose it completely to the passage of time.